Atlantis wasn't just drowned by the sea, it was buried by the church. Myths, ruins, and survivors carried its memory across the world. But why would the church fight so hard to erase it? Because the secrets of Atlantis proved something far more dangerous than myth, that paradise had already been built and it didn't need their permission. The real burial happened in cathedral halls and monastery libraries, where scribes rewrote history and archaeologists were silenced. This isn't about lost cities, this is about forbidden truths powerful enough that an entire institution spent centuries burying them. What if the proof was never lost? What if it's been hiding beneath the waves all along, waiting for eyes brave enough to see? Look beneath the surface of our oceans, and you'll find what they never wanted you to discover. Not random rocks or natural formations, but the architectural remains of civilizations that shouldn't exist according to their timeline. Off the coast of Japan, Yonaguni Monument rises from the seafloor like a stone cathedral built for giants. Massive terraces, carved steps, and geometric precision that mainstream archaeology dismisses as natural erosion. However, since when does erosion cut perfect right angles? Since when does water carve chambers and corridors with the precision of ancient architects? Yet every time researchers try to study it further, funding vanishes like morning mist. Academic careers end. The site gets labeled as too controversial for serious investigation. In the waters off India's coast lies Dwarka, the legendary city described in ancient Sanskrit texts with the detail of someone who walked its streets. Underwater explorations have revealed stone structures, walls, and artifacts that date back over 9,000 years. That's 4,000 years before agriculture was supposedly invented, before humans learned to write, before civilization began, according to the official story. Nevertheless, there it sits, carved and constructed, mocking everything you were taught about human development. In the Caribbean, Bimini Road stretches beneath turquoise waters like a highway to nowhere. Massive limestone blocks arranged in patterns too deliberate for nature, too precise for accident. The Bahamas government won't allow full excavation. They call it too controversial, but dangerous to whom? To a timeline that depends on humanity being young, primitive, and dependent on divine intervention for progress. Here's what they don't want you to notice. Every one of these sites challenges the biblical timeline. If advanced civilizations existed and were destroyed by rising seas 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, then the flood narrative becomes complicated. It's no longer about divine punishment for human wickedness. Consequently, it becomes about natural catastrophes, claiming developed societies that built their own versions of paradise without asking permission. And that's a truth the church has been fighting to keep buried for over 1,000 years. Atlantis wasn't alone. Across every culture, every continent, the same story echoes like a whispered secret passed through generations. Cities swallowed, knowledge lost, paradise erased. You've been taught that flood myths are just variations of Noah's story, borrowed and corrupted by pagan cultures. But what if the church got it backwards? What if Noah's flood was their version of something much older, much more widespread, and much more threatening to their narrative of unique salvation? From the Celtic coasts of Brittany comes the legend of Ys, a magnificent city ruled by King Gradlon and his daughter Dahut. The city was protected by bronze gates and dikes that held back the hungry sea, until one night the waters claimed it all. But Ys wasn't just any city, it was described as a place of learning, art, and spiritual knowledge that made Rome look like a village. The church later demonized Dahut as a corruption incarnate, yet earlier tales paint her as a keeper of ancient wisdom that predated Christianity by centuries. Off the coast of Ireland, sailors reported sightings of High Brazil, a phantom island that appeared every 7 years like clockwork, shrouded in otherworldly mist. When brave souls managed to land, they found not ruins, but a living city populated by beings who possessed knowledge of the stars, healing, and time itself. The island would vanish before they could return with others, before they could bring proof. Convenient, wouldn't you say? The church labeled these accounts as devil's illusions, demonic temptations designed to lead souls away from true salvation. Across the ocean, Mesoamerican codices speak of multiple world destruction by flood, each one claiming advanced civilizations that had grown too proud, too knowledgeable, too independent. But notice the pattern. In every version, the destroyed civilization possessed something valuable: knowledge, technology, spiritual wisdom, direct connection to the divine that didn't require intermediation. Furthermore, in every version, survivors carried that knowledge forward like torchbearers in the darkness. The church's strategy was brilliant in its cold simplicity. Rebrand these global memories as allegory, frame them as primitive attempts to understand Noah's flood. Insist that only one flood mattered, only one narrative held truth. As a result, they erased an entire category of human memory. Memory of a time when knowledge belonged to humanity, not clergy. If these buried truths are stirring something in you, hit subscribe and ring that notification bell. They didn't all drown. The wise ones escaped, carrying their secrets to distant shores like refugees carrying the last flames of a dying civilization. But the church called them demons for a reason, didn't they? What if the gods weren't gods at all? What if they were refugees from a drowned world, carrying fragments of lost knowledge to cultures still learning to build fire? From Mesopotamia comes Oannes, the amphibious being who rose from the Persian Gulf like something out of a fever dream to teach the earliest Sumerians the fundamentals of civilization. He brought writing, law, and city building to people who were supposedly still nomadic hunters. Ancient accounts describe him not as a fish god, but as a man in a fish-like garment, someone who came from beneath the waters, carrying knowledge from a place that existed before the flood, changed everything. In Egypt, Thoth appears in the earliest dynasties as the keeper of divine knowledge, the inventor of writing, the measurer of time itself. However, here's what's fascinating. Thoth's wisdom wasn't described as newly created. It was ancient, inherited from a previous age, a time before the current world began. Egyptian texts speak of Thoth's followers, the Shemsu Hor, who built the first temples and established the mystery schools. These weren't mythical beings floating on clouds. They were described as flesh and blood teachers carrying knowledge from before the flood. In Mesoamerica, Kukulkan arrived among the Maya and Quetzalcoatl among the Aztecs, both described as bearded, fair-skinned culture bringers who emerged from the Eastern Sea like messengers from another age. They taught astronomy that produced calendar systems more accurate than anything Europe had, agricultural techniques that transformed wilderness into abundance. When their work was done, they promised to return from across the waters. Yet they never claimed to be gods. They said they were teachers. But here's what the church couldn't stomach. These culture bringers didn't teach dependence, they taught capability. They didn't demand worship, they shared knowledge. They didn't establish churches, they built schools. Can you see why this had to be buried? They embodied the possibility that human beings could access divine knowledge directly, without permission, without salvation, purchased through institutional submission. Therefore, the church rewrote them all. Oannes became a demon of the waters. Thoth became associated with dark magic and forbidden arts. The survivors of Atlantis were systematically demonized, their teachings buried, their memory corrupted into cautionary tales about seeking knowledge outside approved channels. This wasn't about protecting souls from deception. This was about protecting power from competition. The church didn't suppress Atlantis and its survivors because the story was false. They suppressed it because it was devastatingly true. And truth, in this case, was existentially threatening to everything they were building. Atlantis represented a civilization that achieved paradise through knowledge, not faith. A society that connected with the divine through understanding, not obedience. Where salvation was a state of consciousness, not a transaction with an institution. Where human potential was limitless, not forever stained by original sin requiring eternal mediation. If the Atlantean survivors were real, then humanity had already proven its capability for direct divine connection. The culture bringers didn't establish churches, they established schools. They didn't demand tithes. They shared techniques freely. They didn't create dependency. They empowered independence. How could the church allow people to remember that? Their entire model depended on spiritual scarcity, on the belief that divine knowledge was rare, dangerous, and could only be safely accessed through approved intermediaries, on the conviction that humans were fallen creatures requiring constant guidance and salvation through institutional submission. If people remembered they once built paradise without permission, what would happen to that carefully constructed dependency? Consequently, they launched a systematic campaign of erasure that lasted centuries. Archaeological sites that challenged biblical chronology were dismissed or defunded. Ancient texts speaking of pre-flood civilizations were hidden in Vatican vaults or burned as heretical. Flood myths from other cultures were rebranded as corrupted versions of Noah's story. Indigenous teachings about natural and cosmic wisdom were suppressed as witchcraft. Most importantly, they attacked the idea itself, the possibility that human consciousness could evolve, that civilizations could rise to spiritual heights, that paradise could be built through knowledge rather than granted through faith. Because if people believed that, if they remembered that, if they started acting on that, then the church became unnecessary, irrelevant, obsolete. But the knowledge didn't die with the survivors. It went underground, hidden within secret societies that preserved Atlantean wisdom through symbols, rituals, and coded teachings. What if the church's greatest fear wasn't just the memory of Atlantis, but the living continuation of its mysteries? In the early 17th century, mysterious documents appeared across Europe announcing the existence of the Rosicrucians. The Fama Fraternitatis spoke of a secret brotherhood possessing ancient wisdom, universal reform, and spiritual truths that predated Christianity. They claimed their knowledge came from the mystery schools of Egypt, from Thoth's followers, from the same source that once guided Atlantis. The church responded with immediate condemnation. These weren't Christian mystics seeking God's grace. These were inheritors of forbidden knowledge, carriers of the same wisdom that had made Atlantis dangerous. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn emerged centuries later, openly studying alchemy, astrology, and what they called ancient knowledge traditions. Their initiates practiced what they believed were the same spiritual sciences once mastered in Atlantis: direct connection to divine wisdom through understanding, not faith; transformation of consciousness through knowledge, not salvation. The church had spent over a millennium trying to erase these very concepts. Even more threatening were the Theosophists, who spoke openly of Vril, a psychic force allegedly preserved from Atlantis by a hidden elite. Helena Blavatsky claimed this energy was the same power that once elevated Atlantean civilization before its fall. The church couldn't burn these societies like it burned ancient texts. They were too widespread, too organized, too deeply embedded in European intellectual circles. Instead, they used a different strategy: ridicule, dismissal. They labeled them as occultists, devil worshippers, charlatans playing with dangerous forces beyond their understanding. But what if these societies were exactly what they claimed to be? Keepers of knowledge that survived the flood, the fall, and centuries of suppression? What if they represented the unbroken chain connecting modern humanity to the wisdom of Atlantis? The church's reaction suggests they believed it too. After all, why wage such a relentless war against fantasy? These hidden brotherhoods embodied everything the church had tried to destroy. The belief that humans could access divine truth directly, that spiritual evolution was possible through knowledge rather than submission. That paradise could be rebuilt by those who remembered how it was constructed the first time. As a result, they became the church's new target, the latest chapter in an ancient war between institutional control and individual enlightenment. Atlantis wasn't supposed to fit into history, but ruins that shouldn't exist keep surfacing, and every one of them cracks the church's carefully built timeline. High in Turkey's hills lies Göbekli Tepe, a temple complex buried beneath 20 feet of earth, carbon dated to 11,000 years ago. That's 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than agriculture itself. Towering stone pillars weigh tons, carved with animals, symbols, and astronomical alignments. According to official history, humanity at this time was supposed to be nomadic hunter-gatherers, with no architecture, no farming, no mathematics. And yet here it stands, the world's first temple, built by hands guided by knowledge we were never supposed to have. Why does this matter? Because Göbekli Tepe's age places it dangerously close to the supposed time of Atlantis' fall. If survivors carried fragments of lost knowledge, this is exactly the kind of impossible site they would have built. A marker, a memory, proof that civilization existed before the biblical timeline even began. And then there's the mystery off the coast of Cuba, where sonar scans in 2001 revealed massive geometric structures 600 meters beneath the ocean. Researchers reported what looked like pyramids, roads, and stone blocks arranged in patterns impossible to dismiss as natural. Independent verification has been blocked, government access denied, and the story quietly buried. But if true, these ruins would rewrite human history overnight. They'd prove that entire civilizations were swallowed by rising seas, just as the Atlantis story described. Why won't the world's institutions allow full exploration? Because every one of these sites points to the same truth. Humanity was building temples and cities thousands of years before Genesis claims creation even began. The Church's narrative demands that civilization was young, dependent on divine guidance. But the ruins whisper otherwise. We were ancient, independent, and capable of paradise long before the flood. If these buried ruins are stirring something in you, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. Because the deeper we dig, the more forbidden truths rise to the surface. But ruins weren't the only things that survived. The blueprint of Atlantis lived on, hidden in geometry, architecture, and symbols that carried its memory forward in plain sight. Look at Gothic cathedrals rising across Europe in the Middle Ages. To the faithful, they were monuments to God. To initiate, their soaring arches and rose windows encoded the same sacred geometry Plato described in Atlantis: concentric perfection, cosmic alignment, mathematics as prayer. Every arch was a formula, every spire a resonance chamber. The Church preached salvation beneath them, but the stones themselves whispered of an older science. Then came the Freemasons. Their lodges spoke openly of being builders, inheritors of a craft that was more than stonework. Their symbols, the compass, the square, the all-seeing eye, traced back not to medieval guilds, but to the same geometric principles that shaped Plato's drowned city. For them, Atlantis wasn't a myth. It was memory, encoded in architecture, carried forward so it could never truly be erased. Even modern capitals carry the echo. Washington, D.C.'s street plan has been accused of embedding Atlantean geometry, circles, squares, and star alignments that mirror Plato's description of the concentric rings. Was this coincidence, or deliberate design by men who believed themselves the inheritors of a drowned world's wisdom? The Church saw this for what it was: rebellion through architecture. Cathedrals that glorified knowledge as much as faith. Secret orders that built temples to memory instead of dogma. Cities designed not for worship, but for resonance. In stone, symbol, and geometry, Atlantis had survived, not as ruins, but as a blueprint. And every time a new cathedral was raised, every time a mason laid stone, the drowned city was rising again, not from the sea, but from the human imagination. What if Atlantis was never just a city drowned in the past? What if it was a prophecy, a mirror held up to humanity's future? Every fragment we've uncovered points to the same conclusion. Atlantis wasn't destroyed because it sinned. It was destroyed because it proved too much. It showed that humans could build paradise without divine permission, that knowledge could replace faith, that consciousness itself could touch the fabric of creation. And that idea was too dangerous to survive in memory, but memory has a way of returning. Every ruin that defies the timeline, every myth of flood and survival, every society that dares whisper forbidden truths, they are all part of the same pattern. Atlantis is not just behind us, it's ahead of us. Because what do you see when you look at modern civilization? Towers of glass rising like temples of light, machines splitting atoms, bending energy, capturing the building blocks of reality itself. A species on the edge of commanding forces once attributed only to gods. We are replaying the Atlantean script, step by step, discovery by discovery, daring the flood to come again. This is why the church fought so hard to erase the myth. Not because of what it said about the past, but because of what it warned about the future. If Atlantis is a prophecy, then humanity is destined to rise again to the same heights, and maybe to fall again, unless we learn what the drowned city was trying to teach. The real question is not whether Atlantis existed, it is whether we are rebuilding it now. And if we are, will we repeat its downfall, or finally prove that paradise can rise and endure, not as myth, but as destiny? So maybe Atlantis was never just a drowned city, but a mirror, showing us who we were and who we are becoming again. The ruins beneath the waves aren't just stone. They're reminders, proof that humanity once rose higher than the history books allow, and that the memory of that rise still lives within us. The myths weren't just warnings. They were messages carried through time, whispering, "You've done this before, and you'll do it again." The church buried Atlantis because it wasn't a myth. It was competition, a blueprint for a future where no priest, no cathedral, no institution could stand between humanity and the divine. A future where knowledge was salvation and paradise wasn't promised. It was built. And here's the haunting truth. Every time we split an atom, map a genome, or explore the depths of consciousness itself, we are standing on the same threshold the Atlanteans once crossed. The question isn't whether Atlantis existed. The question is whether its memory exists in us, urging us to rise again, or warning us of another fall. So I'll leave you with this. If Atlantis wasn't just history, but prophecy, do you believe we're rebuilding it now? And if we are, will we survive it this time? Drop your theory in the comments below and subscribe to Ancient Underworld, because the myths they buried are the memories that could change everything.